This video is brought to you today by Fatshark and DARKTIDE.
This is Woodward. Status red emergency. Tertium Hive is under direct assault. I have taken shelter in a neighboring zone because it is no longer safe where I was.
Orders confirmed. Kill them all. By the rod, and the way, and the three-lobed eye, by pestilence unbound and eternity.
Say again. The Astra Militarum assets assigned to assist the crisis situation have turned on us. They are attacking the Hive. I repeat, the Mobian 6, Blacklist, and Celebrated Regiment has turned. Throne, save us. They are attacking the Hive and intend to kill us all. I have seen the bodies of the dead in the streets. Hundreds. I have seen transit stations on fire. They have secured beachheads and are advancing. We have no means to resist. Morningstar, I beseech you for the love of the God Emperor who protects us all. Answer me!
Within the Imperial system of the Mobian domain, a wave of darkness has been approaching. A tide of traitors, and finally, it has not only reached the core system world of Atoma Prime, it is breaking upon it. You are required to stand against that tide. To be like the rocks which surrounded ancient lit citadels, you must stand now equally unbreakable as the traitors return and the filth and corruption they bring now breaks over Atoma Prime. We return today to investigate and look at the details and background of the upcoming 40k Hive City internal warzone, DARKTIDE. Specifically today we are looking at characters and their factional background, and those corrupted traitors threatening the stability of Atoma Prime itself, how they came to be, and the context of just what this means. It's worth remembering that for all the horrors in the galaxy of M41, the greatest enemy, and often not just for humanity, is the Scourge of Chaos. The great enemy poses such an existential threat not purely for the immediate dangers it represents via its corrupted servants, nor is it beholden only to the demonic horrors that it can unleash, but also for how it has already begun to twist, distort and shape human civilization and the Imperium. Of course, the Horus Heresy is one of the most notable examples of this, but since the Emperor's Great Unification, it would be fair to say that Chaos and those entities who exist in the Warp have been steadily distorting and twisting the consciousness of humanity to their very will. This can even be said to be true in its positive forms, for while those who serve the Emperor and Imperium, known as Inquisitors, are considered of course to be working in the service of the greater good to defend the populace of Imperial worlds and protect its institutions from corruption, it might also be observed that the perverse existence of Chaos has necessitated the existence of Inquisitors and thereby created a change in human culture, a change that many would objectively argue is not always for the better. This is the nightmare of Chaos. It seeps into the minds of mortals on distant rimworlds or the bowels of hive cities. Before long, cult-like groups are practicing bizarre scarification rituals, morally offensive acts, and performing sacrifices in a vain attempt to awaken demonic entities or for one of their number to become possessed. Their actions more often than not puppeted as part of some Machiavellian plot by dark powers outside the comprehension of ordinary mortal citizens. There are many ways that malevolent entities bridge the space between the immaterium and materium. The role of an Inquisitor, their entourage, agents and operatives, is to root out the cause of those before it is too late, and unfortunately for Atoma Prime, things have quickly spiraled out of control. On some worlds it may be enough to follow up on rumours of hearsay, conspiracy, disruptive elements, subtle details upon a world that may amount to nothing, or they may be the early indicators of a devastating slide into apocalyptic corruption that requires no less than exterminatus. The real skill of the Inquisitor is to discern which smoke trails lead to nothing more than ordinary human rumblings of discontent that will undoubtedly be subsequently crushed by a security or administrative crackdown, and which point to the smouldering embers of treachery, those which are ready to catch fire and, for the demonic winds of the warp, blow into a furnace of heresy. The Imperium of Mankind is a powerful galaxy-spanning empire. They wield devastating forces such as the Astartes, Imperial Guard and Sororitas, not to mention also having at their disposal the immense world-breaking power of the Mechanicus and Titan legions. Yet, for all of its power, the Imperium is often fragile. It is stretched thinly across its millions of worlds, and for an Inquisitor to commit forces and time to a world that turns out to be nothing more than just plain civil unrest is a disastrous waste of time and resources. To be an effective and powerful Inquisitor, it is about sifting through the oceans of sand to find those grains of truth, separate the factual wheat from the mythical chaff, and find the key to the puzzle presented, most importantly, to do so in a timely fashion. For the world of Atoma Prime, time has run out. It is clear that things have already spiraled into a disastrous cascade of corruption. So for the Inquisitor arriving at Atoma, using their agents, and for us in the role of the intelligence gatherers, the question is less how much of a risk of corruption there is, and more how can it be stopped. While some may presume the only solution is to deploy an immediate and full-scale military operation to a hive, especially one as massive as Tertium, with its population nearing 100 billion, the wise Inquisitor knows to exercise caution here. The great enemy of the warp plays many games, lays many traps. What may appear to be a straightforward situation may in fact not be so. What may appear to involve only one of the ruinous powers of the Void may be a careful play in their eternal great game. One of those gods of the warp may in fact be setting up a trap for another, and the humans are merely required to play their part on this infinite chessboard. The extreme danger when dealing with corruption, as has broken out within Tertium, is not at all as simple as merely eradicating the enemy. It's not as simple as a commander looking at a battlefield deployment, assessing reports of enemy units and movements, and calculating a strategy. By comparison, such decisions are child's play. Inquisitors must weigh a vast hoard of information in calculating what actions to take in a situation as is occurring on Tertium. Who are the players involved? What has happened thus far? What is the overall and immediate risk to the integrity of the rest of the Hive City? Can it be contained beyond the already locked down sectors? What measures are necessary to facilitate this? Are there additional Xenos factors at play? Will the heretics bring reinforcements? Perhaps most importantly, are they aware of us? If so, what do they know? Are they calculating moves against us already, and even ahead of what we are already considering? It becomes very complex very quickly, and all of these are factors that an Inquisitor must use to make the best, most efficiently calculated decision. Dealing with the planetary assault by the forces of chaos is no simple uprising by a bunch of citizens with fanciful ideas of freedom and self-determination. Such matters can be easily crushed with chainsawed teeth and a splash of promethium, paired perfectly of course with the public disciplinary measures of the ecclesiarchy. An empire does not survive 10,000 years without knowing how to quell those unwashed masses. A corrupting torrent of heresy though? This is a matter entirely incomparable to disruptive citizenry on any scale. To deal with such a situation, an Inquisitor can only be effective if they secure accurate and timely information for the given situation. Without it, they may end up walking into a trap, pouring unwitting fuel onto a fire, or just boxing themselves into a corner of failure. We must never play into the hands of the enemy, for they are extremely devious, cunning, and experienced in twisting humans to meet their own ends. So this is where the high importance and role of the intelligence gatherers becomes clear. The role we will play in DARKTIDE is that of those Inquisitors' operations on the ground, the front line, not communicating directly with the Inquisitor of course, but through their agents deployed in orbit and on the ground. The role played through us in the exploration of Tertium is pivotal. To root out the corruption, discover what horrors lie beneath the surface, and also find out what is the root cause of the situation. But then of course there are the other disturbing factors such as the Mobian Sixth. The Imperial Guard, who have been for the longest time waging a campaign out on the fringe worlds of the system to keep the peoples of Atoma Prime and all the other populated worlds of the Mobian domain safe and free from invasion. Clearly that has failed, and now it's not just a matter of hive corruption, there is the prospect of a far bigger conflict occurring, something which likely right now is still entirely unaware for most of Atoma Prime's 90 billion citizens. Most worlds of the Imperium, but especially Hive worlds, are also responsible to produce their own local defensive militia forces or regular guard. Either way, they'll be falling collectively under the banner of the Astra Militarum. It is of course typical then that those who are drafted from the citizenry will only have very limited training on their homeworld, unless of course they're part of a specific world dedicated to military production such as Vostroya, Krieg, Talon, Mordian, and so on. For the more basic Hive worlds which are just involved in production, such as Tertium, any regiments of guard produced will only have been given base training. They may have some time with specific training en route to their destination, but it's fair to say that most of the time they will have little to any real concept of just what they will face, and 99% of the time those individuals will never return home. So there are few, if any, to then pass back information to the Hive world and its citizenry. For those who do return, they have undoubtedly, of course, embellished and built up the reputation of themselves and their own regiments. And the Mobian 6th has become known as this tough veteran regiment who have served the longest and fought the hardest out among the dangerous rim worlds of the Mobian domain. Now, Darktide is not just the title of the game. The Darktide is something that had until recently been mythical among the citizenry, something that was spoken of as happening out there in the galaxy. As new recruits were sent off time and again aboard transports to go out to the edge of the system, they were sent specifically to hold back what was referred to as the Dark Tide. It's actually a very interesting concept that is explored here, that an Imperial system is actually fully aware that a great darkness is threatening them, but they feel confident that they are capable of handling it, perhaps because they don't fully understand the implications of what that might mean. Their disconnected ignorance prevents them from fully comprehending just how dangerous it is until it is already bearing down on them and then hit the panic button. It's very possible that entire ships of guard were fully destroyed before they were even deployed out in the darkness of the edge of the Mobian domain, or the Hive world of Atoma Prime may have thought it was fighting the good fight, when in actuality they were just sending ship after ship of new recruits to be corrupted and build up the numbers of the threat that would eventually arrive to assault the Prime world. Within the galaxy, the Mobian domain is of course a tiny area, but in real terms it's a large area of space. This is something that can often be lost when we always hear about navigators travelling through the warp, so space travel often appears to be quite instant. But within the system, many ships are still travelling around at more of an ordinary speed. If the distances are reachable in a matter of months, the dangers of warp travel will outweigh the benefits that they might gain in time saved. The point being, the distance within the Mobian domain is significant enough that those on the Prime world cannot with accuracy discern what is occurring out on the rumbling war on the edge of their system. They just know that it's been ongoing for a long time and continue to send manpower and resources to support the cause. Meanwhile, on Atoma Prime, the bureaucratic leadership and its ruler, Lord Margrave, are far more focused upon paying tithes to terror. This is the primary focus of their attention. The endless slaughter out on the edge of their system is very, very far away. It's not something that seems real to most on a day-to-day basis. It's just in the back of their mind. And then suddenly, it is very real. It's not out there, it's here, it's now, it's breaking through sectors, infecting Hive citizens that are rioting. Reports are coming in of entire districts down in the lower sections of the Hive city falling to an unseen enemy. Broken reports are panicked, confused, losses are mounting, local defense forces are chewed up and not heard from again. The corruption is spreading through the Hive like wildfire and seems unstoppable. They hit the shut it down, shut it all down button, and sectors are locked down. They dig in, they post heavy defensive positions at entry-exit points to the sectors of the Hive that are already lost, but the Darktide has arrived. It is still spreading, it is unstoppable. The Mobian 6th have returned to Tertium. Now, it's not an easy thing to summarise the Inquisition, but for the purposes of today I will attempt to do so because it is important in the framing of characters and their role in engaging with the Darktide as they enter Hive Tertium. However, if you want the real detail about what an Inquisitor is, I recommend you go and watch my far more comprehensive 2-part series linked below and at the end of this video. Inquisitors essentially are the ultimate authority in the galaxy of the Imperium. They were founded, generally speaking, in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the massive civil war that tore the newly founded Imperium apart. So it was deemed necessary to create an organisation that were answerable only to the Emperor himself, who would seek out and destroy the heretic, the Xenos, and the demonic entities or threat thereof. Inquisitors especially selected individuals of theoretically unbreakable character who are extremely well studied in the means by which the very worst enemies of humanity seek to infiltrate and undermine the foundations of the Imperium. They can demand anything they require to carry out what they deem as being the appropriate way to deal with a situation. None can question their authority, their word carrying as much weight as essentially the Emperor's, because they are to all intents and purposes acting on his behalf. This means they can appropriate anything they need: ships, resources, hardware, manpower, and much more. They can designate entire systems off limits. They can purge hive cities through mass executions on the slightest pretext. They can engage in huge campaigns that scour entire systems if they believe the threat is severe enough, and the only individuals who can hold them to account are their fellow Inquisitors, which has happened on numerous occasions, not least because of excessive deployment of an Inquisitor's most powerful tool upon a world when it has lost all hope of salvation. Inquisitors can deploy the fabled action of Exterminatus, incinerating an entire planet and all who dwell upon it, in the name of the greater good of humanity, the Imperium and the Emperor. This, though, is really just the cover of the book when it comes to understanding what Inquisitors are all about. Yes, they will come when called for to purge the alien forces assaulting a world. They will root out the most Machiavellian of evil schemes festering in the dark corners of a hive world, and they will purge systems of demonic cults who seek to open the gateway to the warp hell of the Immaterium and drown entire planets in a tsunami of demon horrors. Inquisitors have often much more to contend with than what is occurring at face value. For starters, as we've already discussed, Inquisitors have to take careful consideration for all of the different factors facing a crisis. They've got to consider the urgency of the situation, the level of threat in the sense of, is this contained to the world, or could it spread to a system and beyond to engulf entire territories of Imperial control? If that were to occur, what would it mean? Which forge worlds could be destroyed? What knowledge may be lost? They need to consider the forces at their disposal. Will there be enough to contain the danger? What is the probability of a successful outcome here? Should they continue to fight and engage with the enemy so as to try and bring about a conclusion that sees a hive world of billions saved? Or is the situation a foregone conclusion? Will expending resources and manpower merely doom thousands more to death and waste precious resources that could be better used in containing the situation? Would they be better to perhaps burn this world knowing that it will very likely save 2 or 3 or 10 more? Then you come to the additional complicating factor: ideology. Inquisitors originally held fairly straightforward attitudes to their task at hand: purge the heretic, kill the Xenos, and so on. But over 10,000 years, things have become just a little more complex. There is now a plethora of ideological perspectives held by Inquisitors, and again, I don't really have the time to drill down on these today. I suggest again you watch my longer videos on that. For anybody who's not aware though, generally speaking, you have with the Inquisition Ordos. These are the upper designations: the Hereticus, the Xenos, the Malleus Inquisitors. These are not exclusive roles for the Inquisitors who operate within them, but most Inquisitors are designated within a specific Ordo. It's more that they are specialists in that area. There are also many minor Ordos with much narrower scope, such as the Ordo Astartes, tasked with overseeing the Astartes. They look to see that there are no dangerous plots or conspiracies occurring within Space Marine chapters, no risk of heresy, and so on. Some of these minor Ordos are even tasked with watching over other Ordos, policing the police, as it were. From there, Inquisitors will generally branch into 2 schools of thought: Puritan and Radical. Puritans are the highly conservative members of the Inquisition. Their sole focus is that inquisitorial doctrine be upheld. This includes, beyond their regular duties, seeking out and purging those Inquisitors who are deemed to be heretical. From this benchmark, it's a sliding scale of grey into the radical outlook, which essentially represents a willingness to bend the rules of the Inquisition to achieve one's goals. As I say though, it's on a sliding scale from an Inquisitor who might consider, say, using a less than thoroughly vetted recruit for their retinue, to the extreme end of the scale where an Inquisitor may be literally discussing with a demon host of chaos as to what their next order of duty should be. Radical Inquisitors believe that they are following the Imperial doctrines though in spirit, and I should point out that Radical Inquisitors are not necessarily heretics or compromised by chaos, although sometimes that is the case. Mostly though, they simply have come to a perspective that in a galaxy as complex and depressing as the Imperium of M41, they see things in this much bigger picture, which equates to the end always justifying the means. As you progress down the scale of radicalism, you'll find Inquisitors willing to study the ways of their enemy more closely, to even use Chaos or Xenos weaponry against the enemy, under the principles of essentially, if it gets the job done, what's the problem? At the very extreme scale, you might see an Inquisitor employing, like I say, demon hosts, that's demons that are tethered and bound by powerful psychic wards constraining their power, keeping them in a weakened state within the material realm. Usually, of course, such choices lead to disastrous consequences. And then finally, to make things all the more complex, there are a great many individual philosophical outlooks. Since the founding of the members of the Inquisition, these have steadily diverged and fragmented into groups who share common goals and outlooks. Some of these are focused on the continued defense and protection of human civilization, others seek little more than the full resurrection of the Emperor himself. Now, because of the fractured and often clashing nature of these perspectives, it can lead to Inquisitors clashing out in the galaxy, and sometimes wars may even be fought between two rival Inquisitors who both declare the other an enemy of the Imperium. It's kind of like miniature heresy occurring out there. And these perspectives are numerous and complex, but I will mention just a couple of philosophies for each of the Puritan and radical outlooks. Within the Puritan Inquisitors, one of the main schools of thought is known as the Amalathians. They believe that essentially the Emperor has always had a grand plan, and that in fact everything is unfolding exactly as it should. And I've often said that I think that is entirely possible. Their focus is on preventing things from sliding into a worse state and protecting against the very obvious threats as outlined in Inquisitorial doctrine. Although obviously that is slightly contradictory. You also have within the Puritans one of the most famous types of inquisitorial outlook, monodominance. These are the legendary Inquisitors who will shoot first and ask questions later, and who espouse the view that the Imperium, and only the Imperium, should be allowed to exist, which boils down to everything that is not human dies. They're terrifying, and any world or system to encounter a monodominant Inquisitor is at a very high risk of seeing at least mass executions based on very flimsy rationalizations. Because monodominant Inquisitors do tend to see heretics everywhere. Within the radical Inquisitors, one of the main schools of thought is that of the Horesians. They believe that the traitor Primarch Horus Lupercal was a powerful supernatural entity by the end of the Great War, and this is of course demonstrably evident by the fact that the Emperor was nearly killed. So it is their belief that they should find a means by which to recreate this, but to instead forge a leader as powerful that can unite humanity, or even that they create a vessel for the Emperor to pour his spirit into, a divine avatar. For obvious reasons, they're often seen as heretics for these beliefs, and they also clash with the Puritan view known as Thorianism, a splinter of this school of thought and another major philosophy. Another of the radical side is the Xanthites, who advocate for the use of warp-based weaponry such as possessed swords, demon hosts, generally turning the power of chaos against itself. Xanthites believe that chaos can never be totally defeated, because it is merely a reflection of humanity itself. And again, I actually think there's some truth to that. I've spoken about that before. So their quest is in learning how we can best turn its destructive force back upon itself to create some kind of standardized feedback loop that would eventually lead to the protection and general benefit of humanity. Rather than chaos being an eternal enemy, they seek a way to prevent further erosion and keep the tides of the warp at bay. Inquisitors are a complex faction of the 40k verse. They're deeply problematic, but they're also the saviours of many billions of human citizens. Few can see the big picture as clearly as an Inquisitor in the Imperium, and it is with their vast experience that they can be the salvation or damnation of entire worlds, and that time has now arrived for Atoma Prime and Hive Tertium. Now, the reason that I mention all this is that it is very important to understand how complex Inquisitors are, because it is entirely unknown what kind of Inquisitor is arriving to address the situation on Tertium. How will they deal with the corruption of the Darktide deluging the city? Will it be dictated by all the aforementioned factors? Are they a Puritan, a radical? How will their personal ideology inform the actions they take? How will their personal life experience inform this? Are they a brutal monodominant Inquisitor ready to exterminate entire sectors of the Hive in order to save others? Dare they speak the word exterminatus? Or are they a more measured, radical Inquisitor who understands the need to cut the contamination out that is infecting the massive Hive city, yet they simultaneously see a window of opportunity here for research, exploration, and to gain an understanding? We may know more in time, but not yet, for our role is at a more basic level. The scum rejects who will be investigating the happenings on Tertium will likely never get to meet the Inquisitor. That is far from our circle of authority. The teams deployed into the corrupted sections of Hive City will instead be dealing with designated Inquisitorial Operatives. Inquisitors are unlikely to work alone. The broad spectrum of the tasks they must contend with necessitate assistance. Often, the challenges an Inquisitor will face are extremely time sensitive, and so many hands make light work. With that said, most of their teams are usually fairly small. It's hard to find people you can truly trust, especially in M41, and this is critical for an Inquisitor. The sheer power wielded by an Inquisitor makes them extremely important individuals, and so they will have varying circles of protection around them. Their closest being the Inquisitorial retinue, their most trusted advisors who are themselves powerful, bearing shared biometrically coded seals of said Inquisitor. They will act on behalf of the Inquisitor and are most likely the people who will deal with local authorities and administrative bureaucrats. The nobility may, of course, wish to see the Inquisitor themselves because of their status, but that is likely entirely down to the discretion of an Inquisitor. In critical developing situations such as Atoma Prime and Hive Tertium, an Inquisitor and their retinue will deploy other agents below them on their behalf. These are still operatives who have been recruited and are trusted, but their power is lesser by many degrees. They'll be the ones who are recruiting those condemned and overseeing the deployment for intelligence gathering purposes. The Inquisitorial retinue may have deployed one or two of their number to the Hive's upper levels or to its lower districts, accompanied by a security team of, say, Tempestus, potentially Sororitas, or other specially trained security teams, because in such a volatile situation as is unfolding upon Tertium, it is also unlikely that the Inquisitor would leave their ship in orbit unless necessary. Of course, they're not scared to do so, they will if they need to, but it's better that they are overseeing operations, because their primary focus is of course overseeing the situation, making assessments of the intelligence they're provided in coordination with their retinue aboard the ship, discussing together how things are playing out, what it may mean, using their past experience. The agents on the ground will be putting together teams of the very disposable individuals to enter the contaminated areas with a fairly loose approach. These are not specialist forces designed to enter and perform surgical missions. They're not going to have tons of training beforehand. They're not a professionally trained, polished fighting force, and they're not embarking on some specific pre-planned campaign. The forces being deployed to Tertium are the rejects, the dregs of society. It's those who just happen to fit the bill and have been hastily deployed with the very most cursory of assessments, but who on paper have at least at some point proven their worth. They don't appear to be completely irredeemable. They don't want to just send in new recruits for the enemy, they do want people who have a chance of doing their job. Some Inquisitors are undoubtedly brutal and unforgiving in their ideological outlook, but there are many others who are more open-minded enough to realise that there are bigger stakes to worry about, and if success means making use of the materials at their disposal, then they're going to do so. So while the vast majority of the teams deployed to the quarantined Hive zones are just going to be lost without a trace, never to be heard from again, those who survive will gain a modicum of respect. They'll be likely be equipped with a slight upgrade of their gear on secondary and subsequent missions, and with each completed investigation, they steadily will rise in value in the eyes of the Inquisitorial team, because if they're able to survive, they can be given more specific, focused tasks. And should the team of prisoner rejects survive long enough, they may even come onto the radar of the Inquisitor themselves, spoken about from the agents to the retinue to the Inquisitor. This may grant them the opportunity to take on even more critical roles and be trusted with dangerous but highly important tasks in service to the Inquisitor. The ultimate reward could be the opportunity, at the conclusion of such an investigation campaign, to leave the world and continue on with the Inquisitor and their team for future tasks in service of the Imperium. But still, one day at a time, The team have to simply survive to begin with. Such thoughts of glorious promotion, the power and respect that come with it, are a distant passing thought. It's a long, hard road out from the depths of a twisted hive zone, fighting the most dangerous enemies known to humanity, before any thoughts of future achievement can begin to be entertained. Now, any background material always is going to contribute to those who are looking for a more immersive and less purely mechanical experience. Immersion is certainly, of course, and unsurprisingly, my preference. As we enter into the world of Darktide and Hive Tertium, we might well ask, well, who are we as a character? What's our mentality, our motivation as individuals? And there are, of course, tools in the game at the very beginning to help you build and understand who you want your character to be. Because basically, why is it that they're doing what they're doing? Is it as simple as saving one's own life? Is there something more? I think at face value, obviously, the saving of themselves is the core starting point, but once you're past that, it becomes more specific, and I'm intrigued to see how that's going to make us feel as we play into the game, and through, of course, the developments that are to come later. The Zealot, for example, may want to exert revenge and redemption upon the horrors invading the Hive and desecrating the sanctity of a Hive world of the Imperium and the Emperor. I personally think if you can get into that mentality as you play the game, you'll get a lot more out of it. I feel it worthwhile to note this because obviously here on this channel, as you might have noticed, I take the lore pretty seriously for the most part, because that's what I enjoy about 40k. I enjoy approaching it seriously. That's what's fun about 40k for me. I enjoy considering its details, its parameters, as close to as if they were reality. And just in general, I enjoy things like that. I enjoy movies that have a more documentary feel to them, because I think that better conveys the reality of whatever story is being told. Now, with all of that said, of course, especially in 40k, we can never ignore the suspension of disbelief necessary to accept some aspects of it. Nor should we forget the underpinning of Warhammer 40,000, that it's a darkly satirical look at what happens when the worst motivations of humanity are allowed to spiral out of control unchecked, and as I've often noted, not dissimilarly to Dread in that regard. At the same time, being aware that something is fiction and dealing with pretty horrific issues of ethics and morality doesn't mean it can't be enjoyed at an immersive level. This is, of course, the entire beauty of 40k. You can be horrified by the actions and stories of those within it, and simultaneously bathe in the glory of the Emperor's Crusade, the heroics of the Siege on Terror, the Death Cult assassins as they carve up and eat their victims alive. It's not afraid to introduce characters who make a mockery of those who might build themselves up too much. Olivia Soraka, for example. By being reframed merely via the lens and perspective of someone who does not accept such things at face value, for they have seen all of human history and understand the truth, they do not gaze in awe or drop to their knees in worship of their demigod abomination leaders, because they help us to understand that it is okay to have multiple perspectives within the narrative verse of 40k itself, let alone for us who are on the outside looking in. This is always the beauty of 40k. It presents an opportunity for all tastes. You might be the kind of person who enjoys viewing it through a very immersive lens, or you might be looking for a more mechanically sound experience of pure completion. And then, of course, there are those just looking for a good laugh and smashing some heads, and I think we all know what tabletop army those people likely collect. In Darktide, we can be that frenzied guardsman who can't hold back from shooting anything in sight and charges in regardless until their bloodlust is abated. You can be the raging zealot foaming at the mouth who is fueled constantly by a burning pain in her soul that can only be quenched by killing heretics. You can be the loyal Ogryn who has been long stood by the side of his guardsman sergeant, who have now been together, rescued from a potential terminal life of hard labour in a prison colony, now granted an opportunity to serve once more together. You can be the outcast child who hid their entire life and evaded black ships of the Sisters of Silence, who was always on the run, always in the shadows, evading detection until now, but through a twist of fate was not sent back to Terror, and has been given an opportunity to serve in a different way, and one which may not bring an immediate painful death. This is really what Darktide is offering to us, presenting an experience that you can customize to your own degree. And I can very much imagine some people I know who enjoy the RPG side of 40k who may well play this game totally immersively, staying in character. I also know more than a few who want to get some fun and games smashing heretics while we all have a few beers. and that's the point. It's whatever you want to make out of it. Of course, the story of Tertium is going to be unraveled through progression, but those continual shifting scales of challenge will bring an ongoing experience. All of this is nothing new. For those of you who have been around on the channel for a long time, you recall for years and years that I've said that games are just whatever you want to make out of them. Of course, the game has to deliver at a base level to the point where the world is a solid narrative and good mechanical experience that feels right. But you're an active participant as well. What you contribute to the experience is part of the process, and the more you put in, the more you get out. Or at least in my humble opinion, that's how it is anyway. So to give some more depth to each of the roles you can take on in DARKTIDE, let us consider in a little more detail the prospective background of those that we can choose to be in DARKTIDE. Maybe it'll give you some more pause for thought about how you choose to play as a character and their speculative motivations. For the veteran, be that local militia or Imperial Guard, their lives will have been consumed by rules and regulations. If you've ever read the Imperial Munitorum Manual or the Primer, then you would know that near enough any small error warrants physical punishment. The Imperial Guard are unforgiving and will beat and berate the human currency of the Imperium into shape. And they represent one of the most powerful weapons the Imperium has on its side when they go to war against the various enemies of humanity. That weapon being sheer weight of numbers. Ironically, not entirely dissimilarly to the Tyranids. The Imperium will just deluge Xenos and the unspeakable horrors of chaos with weight of bodies and cheap, readily replaceable equipment. The lasgun, for example, is not a weapon celebrated and honoured by the Imperium because it is a refined, super powerful infantry weapon. It's respected because the Imperial Guard require millions upon millions of lasguns to be produced consistently, and the manufactorum across all hive worlds continually produce this basic tool of war. Lasguns are reliable, lightweight and easily produced, thus making them the ideal and perhaps only suitable weapon for Guard regiments that will enable them all to be equipped and ready prior to transport and deployment. The speed with which Imperial regiments, militia, Guard have to be forged is a reason why they have to be just hammered into shape. There's often little time for careful, extended training. New recruits have to be beaten into it and shipped out. The massive numbers involved in creating regiments, or at least training units to become part of an existing one, mean that rejects can easily be reassigned to other tasks. If a war is critical and impending upon a planet, then individuals are more valuable and perhaps shouldn't be so easily wasted, because if likely they have less than a week to live anyway, why execute them for training infractions? Better they're just sent into battle and have some chance to prove their worth. Of course, that's going to depend somewhat on the outlook of the world. Upon Krieg or Mordian, it's unlikely that any minor infraction is going to get a pass. On other Imperial worlds though, where distant rumbling conflicts are not really pressing matters, judgment will be down to an individual drill sergeant or officer. There are of course innumerable ways for someone training or deployed as guardsmen to end up on a prison ship. They could have been skimming some food off, keeping a few delicious tins of amble meat for their own private consumption. Maybe they were caught disobeying a direct order. Again, some of these matters would warrant execution or at least a hard flogging in some areas, but for others, service as a prisoner of the Imperium or in a penal legion may still be a worse fate than summary execution. So, for a veteran to be given a second chance, an opportunity to prove their worth, or more likely just escape a fate worse than death, it's unlikely that they would have to be asked twice. For a humble guardsman, be that veteran or otherwise, the opportunity to serve in an Inquisitorial agent's investigation team seemed probably like a very good idea at the time. Being sent to do hard labour on some forsaken prison world was not a fate one could envisage as ending with anything other than a miserable, cold, painful death. At least now, they may have an opportunity to die on their own terms, to escape, or who knows, that optimistic dream of performing well enough that they could be redeemed or even rise to the ranks and join an Inquisitorial retinue. But first things first, we just need to make it out alive. Ogryns are commonly seen as lovable oafs, big on the bicep, a little lacking in the old noggin, but honestly that is perhaps a little unfair. The Imperium designates them as part of their umbrella classification of abhuman. The Imperium generally is extremely intolerant to mutants or variations of humanity, but it does allow some to exist within parameters. This was apparently much broader during the time of the Emperor, but by M41, unsurprisingly, it has become considerably more repressive. Abhumans are variations evolved from human stock, but changed or mutated to a greater or lesser degree. They differ from true mutants in that they conform to recognizable physical standards. They're no more prone than normal humans to further mutation. There are many millions of abhumans living within the Imperium, and they're very tolerated and exploited by the authorities just as much as the rest of the population. It's rare, though, for them to reach positions of authority or power within the Imperial hierarchy, and many are of course subjected to just mockery, fear for life, or prejudice. Many abhumans are recruited into service of the Administratum and its various subdivisions, including, say, the Astra Militarum, the Imperial Fleet, but within the Imperial Guard they're organised and fight in dedicated squads or companies that are segregated from their human comrades. And Ogryn are believed to be a humankind who have evolved on worlds with harsh, barren environments, high gravity. Most of these planets, having no other use, steadily began to be used as prison worlds. And the most notable Ogryn feature is their huge bulk. They're massive, powerful individuals standing between 2-3 meters tall, and they vary in appearance according to different worlds, but all are huge, tough and powerful. They are unfortunately known also for having less admirable traits, notably hygiene and general manners, but if that's the worst somebody can say about you in the galaxy of M41, I'd take it. Within the Administratum, Ogryns are carefully tracked and monitored for any significant deviation in their abhuman status. Where Ogryns are lacking though, they make up for with their towering physicality. For an Imperial Guardsman, having an Ogryn around is definitely no bad thing. Their massive bulk means they can shrug off wounds that would kill a Guardsman outright. And for this reason the Astra Militarum deploy Ogryn as shock troops. Their dulled mental capabilities mean that they're rarely intimidated and can withstand enemy that would cause more basic trained Guardsmen to break and run. While they're good for frontline charges and shock assaults, they're limited in as much as their equipment must be simple and rugged. For one thing, Ogryn need to be able to understand how to operate it, which is akin to the understanding of most orcs, aka gun goes boom. Then of course the very high likelihood that any given moment the weapon could become an improvised melee weapon, and because of their size and strength, they're not the kind of person that you'd want to give a glass cannon to. So their specifically designed Ogryn Ripper guns fire with burst limiters to stop the Ogryns also just burning through all their ammo instantly, which is exactly what would happen every single time were it not for these built-in limiters, not to mention the chances that they would just start shooting their weapon for the enjoyment of the sound. While powerful and enthusiastic, Ogryns are pretty easily confused. Complex tactical plans are not something an Ogryn can be assigned with, and most of the time their role in combat is to simply charge in and scatter the enemy to the ground so that regular forces can take that opportunity to pick off disorientated enemy. Ogryn are best used when they're simply pointed in a direction and left to charge forward, smashing everything in their path. Within the Militarum there is also another class of Ogryn known as Bullgryn. These are quite simply heavily armoured Ogryn who lock their massive shields together and march toward enemy as an unmovable force. When they reach melee range they can just bludgeon an enemy into submission with massive club weapons, breaking bones, shattering enemy forms and crushing them as a broken mess as they doggedly march forward, providing cover for the standard guard bringing up the rear. Why an Ogryn would end up being rejected and aboard a prison vessel? The options are numerous. They might have just been difficult to control, many Ogryn are not particularly socially disciplined, or they might have fallen foul of some Jobsworth Imperial officer who just took a dislike to them not fulfilling Section 35C of the training ground regulations. Just as likely they were caught stealing when they were hungry and didn't really understand their own actions or why they were really being reprimanded. Their motivations are simple, and Ogryn are extremely loyal to those who befriend them, and especially within the organisation of the Militarum. They will fight bitterly to defend those around them, and are an excellent choice when you're going up against hordes of corrupted enemy. Having someone big around to scatter them like confetti is no bad thing. The Ecclesiarchy are perhaps one of the most terrifying factions within the Imperium. It is, after all, what is used as a means to control and break down the citizenry in service of the Emperor. The lives of billions are consumed through daily rigid and brutal indoctrination from near birth. Citizens of the Imperium grow up in hive cities, suffocated by propaganda, which tells them only of the victories in great battles far from home, the heroes that are made. They're taught to hate all that is not them, and they exist in a reality surrounded by a culture that refuses to accept any other view than what is standard doctrine, and actively destroys all others with extreme prejudice. Imperial officers, sororitas, ecclesiarchy, even the Inquisition and assassins originate from what is known as the Schola Progenium. These are specialist Imperial schools that usually contain the children of Imperial nobles or other high-ranking Imperials. These are nearly always orphan children. It's less an education than it is being selected for enforced roles within the Imperium, and for most it will mean progression to becoming a Tempestus. The Schola Progenium is perhaps one of the most bleak and disturbing aspects of the Imperial life. Its entire purpose is to strip away identity, to homogenize, break down and rebuild these orphaned sons and daughters of the Imperial elite, erasing their culture, their family ties, their believed loyalties. Sometimes this is done quite literally with forcible mind wipes. It's even been speculated that on occasion a child which demonstrates qualities suitable for enrollment may be even taken while their parents are still alive. This is of course entirely standard for just Imperial behaviour and likely occurs with little if any subtlety. Parental protests would be just dealt with efficiently by Hive enforcers or other ecclesiarchy enforcers. Now, the reason I mention the Schola is only because these are the figures who will grow up becoming the guardians of the Imperial cult, the defenders of the Imperium. They are the elite, and having been heavily inducted into the Imperial lifestyle will have deep connections with the ecclesiarchy. And whilst it's not impossible for a rejected member of a Schola to become a Zealot, the term Zealot does not really apply to these elite members and that of the ecclesiarchy. It really means just an ordinary citizen who displays a burning passion for the Imperial cult, not limited to just throwing themselves in harm's way or, for example, gathering together with other Zealots to form unofficial militias or in some case extremist groups known as Redemptionists. And those groups will often not have really the means or authorization to do anything, as they're not officially sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. However, they may lead unofficial crusades to purge heretics down into the underhives of hive cities, and these crusades are often extremely bloody and involve essentially the slaughter of any and all they encounter, or they're captured for further interrogation or ritualized execution. So Zealots are not these elite forces. They're not well trained. They are in fact just little more than a rampaging band of extremely faithful, raging Puritans, and for this reason they're rarely seen as constructive by most institutions of the Imperium, including the ecclesiarchy. Zealots can sometimes become an embarrassment. They might attach themselves to those aforementioned members of the Schola Progenium within a hive, or during a so-called war of faith, which is pretty self-explanatory. And this is something often initiated by the ecclesiarchy or the sororitas, and in those situations, Zealots might find sympathetic connections with the sororitas or Imperial Guard, and of course especially puritanical members of the ecclesiarchy. But really, it's all about control. The ecclesiarchy want to be able to control these individuals and use them to their own end. They don't want them doing embarrassing things by just waging wars that are not sanctioned. Their insane fearlessness and desire to slaughter all who dare to contaminate the purity of the Imperial cult makes them very desirable cannon fodder, but also problematic because they can be difficult to control compared to other, more disciplined regular Imperial forces. What happens after that crusading war of faith as well is often the difficult part. Zealots are not typically ready to just go back to their grinding, servile lifestyle. They've usually become consumed by their extreme behaviour so much that they can just descend into near anarchy without direction. Their reality is distorted to the point that all they see now are heretics. In such situations, unfortunately, they might have to be detained or executed. Again, a role for the sororitas, who will put them down and out of their blessed misery whilst whispering hymnals and so forth. As has been demonstrated though, members of the Imperial cult who truly believe in their faith will walk into battle to face down unimaginable nightmares with little more in hand than a flaming torch and cloth to cover them. They might have some kind of melee weapon if it were available, and the lucky ones will have some kind of purifying flamer weapon to burn the heretics to ashes. But the official ecclesiarchy are often not really keen on seeing a rise in extremists. It's something they try to keep damped down, because zealots, while undoubtedly passionate, are commonly problematic to have in a hive city, because if they can't find a suitable channel to direct their burning passion, they may find ever more unreasonable rationalizations to execute, quite literally their passion to see heresy purged from their midst. They may be so clouded by their cult-like beliefs that their reality becomes, yes, distorted, and it can lead to these zealots ravaging, in fact, innocent civilians, just burning, looting and killing in a hive city. So the rise of zealots often leads to them being dispelled pretty quickly by the ecclesiarchy leadership. That might mean the sororitas or just regular hive enforcers. This, though, can again be problematic in and of itself because it can push yet more citizens to become extreme in their thinking as they see those who were supposedly pure of faith being purged by those that are meant to be the bastions of the Imperial cult, and it can be a very severe downward spiral. Zealots are a strange manifestation of the Imperium's religion, and are commonly a problem. It may be noted that speculatively we could consider that this may be in part down to how well a citizenry are managed by the ecclesiarchy upon a world, and if they're adequately and efficiently being delivered sermon and doctrine to the citizenry, making sure their basic needs are met, the Zealots may not find themselves boiling over. If they see the Emperor's faithful are dutifully carrying out their tasks day to day, they will just presume and see that all is well. But this is another reason also why public executions, purging of heretics and the like are never a bad thing for the ecclesiarchy. It helps to keep the masses under control, it helps keep the zealots at bay. And this may be one of those times where the meme about anything being deemed heresy is actually applicable, because sometimes you just need a heretic to burn. What was their heretical crime exactly? Hey now, we don't need to be talking about that. So how does a zealot appear in the band of outcasts for the operational task force of an Inquisitor's agent? Well, a zealot is one of the best choices for this kind of mission. They're fearless, they've got a burning desire to destroy anything that is not a human or that shows signs of heresy. They're going to be a perfectly disposable, passionate tool for an Inquisitor to deploy. Extremely expendable and with faith on their side, not entirely without a decent chance of dealing some significant damage to even a great enemy. In terms of their motivation, or why they would accept the assignment to join the intelligence gathering quests and descend into quarantined areas of Hive Tertium, it should be blatantly obvious that a zealot would be foaming at the mouth at the prospect of such an opportunity to burn and purge any and all they encounter. Simultaneously, it should be extremely obvious how they ended up as a prisoner of the Imperium in the first place, probably because they were caught burning and purging any and all that they encountered. The Psyker is an especially interesting role to see as part of an Inquisitor's investigative force upon a contaminated Hive city, because one might ask, how is it that a Psyker would end up aboard a prison ship? It's unusual, but remember that while some Psykers are detected amid raids upon Imperial worlds by the Sisters of Silence, many Psykers, undetected, continue to hide in the lower depths of Hive cities, or just continually on the run. Some may have, throughout their lives, managed to somehow just control themselves enough to not become under suspicion as a rogue Psyker, and any Psykers who survive their childhood without detection will want to avoid being captured continually, because for the majority this would mean transportation by the black ships to Terra. They likely have seen this happen to friends and loved ones or just other people in their city throughout their lives, and if they board those black ships, they undoubtedly have no idea where they will go. Of course, their destination would be the ever-hungry Emperor who sucks the life from thousands of Psykers every single day. So the life of a rogue Psyker is undoubtedly awful. They grow up not understanding why they're different or why they're shunned by others. They find that they can hear voices, maybe some other abilities in controlling objects, seeing hallucinations, maybe just permanent headaches, which gives them an endlessly bad personality bordering on many different health disorders. This kind of thing is typical of rogue Psykers, and it's why they're often pushed into the fringes of society, which often, again, makes them easier to discover. They may even be cast down into the underhive of a world, and that can become dangerous again because they might spiral out of control. If you were not on a hive world, if you were on, say, a more feral planet, then they're still going to face persecution, especially on, for example, night worlds, where anybody declared a witch or suspected of sorcery is going to suffer a horrible fate, most likely burned alive in some macabre public spectacle. So it's for good reason that many rogue Psykers will have become adept at avoiding authorities, even before the official members of the Astra Telepathica begin looking for them. And this is why very often the Telepathica will tear latent Psykers away from the worlds while they're still children, before they learn how to skillfully evade authorities, and before they learn how to use their abilities. All of this may of course cast the Imperial authorities in something of a bad light. And it only gets worse when they're shipped to Terra, of course, for their inevitable torturous death, sacrificed to the Emperor. However, there are two things worth noting. Firstly, the Emperor must be sustained. Secondly, rogue Psykers, whilst their plight is undoubtedly tragic, their existence continues to pose a very severe threat to any worlds they exist upon. Because rogue Psykers left untrained or unsuppressed are an extreme risk of becoming manipulated by the darkness of the void that their minds connect to. Worse, they risk becoming a portal for the horrors of the warp to spill forth from. On top of this, Psykers are graded on a scale of power, and were an especially powerful Psyker to escape undetected, the havoc they could cause could be disastrous. One such example, of course, the so-called Lord Varlak. Varlak is an infamous rogue Psyker. He's believed to have originated from the world of Korsk II and was but a lowly guardsman. Yet his astonishing charisma allowed him to quickly become ruler of the world and attempt to break away from the Imperium. In actuality, Varlak was using his psychic abilities, a powerful method of persuasion, so much so that no matter how seditious his words, those who he spoke with were convinced that they should obey his orders without question. His falsehoods were their new reality. The entire world was duped into believing the lies of Varlak, and ultimately it would be their downfall. An Inquisitor raised the call for alarm, and the rebelling forces were destroyed, Varlak supposedly killed, but many speculate he used his ability of mental obfuscation to even delude the Astartes and escape to Necromunda. The point of this illustration is that for the Inquisition, one single rogue Psyker can potentially bring a planet to the point of becoming an entirely lost cause. But even if this situation is salvageable, it's bad enough that one person is able to create a situation which then requires massive resources to be deployed to correct the situation. So all of this is why the detection and containment of Psykers remains a thankless, unending task that requires continual, emotionless diligence. To an Inquisitor, every citizen is a potential enemy for humanity, and none should be overlooked. There are many thousands of black ships, but only the highest-ranking adepts in the Astra Telepathica know the true scale of the fleet and the vast scope of its operations. Their singular task is the unending harvest of Psykers for transportation to Terra. Inquisitors, alone among Imperial officials, can secure passage aboard the black ships. They're also able to oversee the identification, capture and incarceration of particularly obstinate rogue Psykers, for who they might have some additional personal interest. For collected unauthorized human Psykers, the black ships are a torturous environment. The crew of a ship will spend most of their time in psychically shielded upper decks, far from the containment holds patrolled by the Sisters of Silence, and numerous other security measures in place are designed specifically to confuse and confound their psychic abilities. Each ship has specially trained adepts whose sole function is to focus their own psychic energies into an occluding sphere, and this metaphysical device broadcasts an invasive signal into the mind of any nearby Psyker, severely disrupting their abilities. Additionally, what amounts to extremely loud white noise is played through the containment areas of the ship to disrupt the minds of the Psykers held there. On top of all of this, the lighting within the hold of the ships remains dim just above darkness, but punctuated with bursts of strobing light to continually blind and disorientate those within. Any food or drink given to the Psykers will mostly contain tranquilizers or sedatives, and the population of them will be regularly rotated from one hold in the ship to another. All of this serves to keep these rogue Psykers in a helpless, confused, compliant state. Many, though, will of course become entirely broken by the time they reach Terra, although this does not make them any less valuable for their ultimate purpose. The most dangerous of Psykers, as identified by Inquisitorial scrutiny or the Sisters, are kept in separate isolation cells deep within the bowels of the containment holds. As they arrive at Terra, their cargo of many thousands of human Psykers are offloaded and sent to the processing halls, the majority graded for consumption by the Emperor and the Astronomicon. Those who have by some miracle of Zen focus retained their sanity are passed on through the myriad departments and institutions responsible for more careful assessment. Some of these will be trained to become officially sanctioned Imperial Psykers. It's possible that on Atoma Prime, the Inquisitor has authorized the use of reappropriated rogue Psykers, not assessed by Terra, but within their own ships in orbit. Inquisitors will have specially designed holding cells aboard their vessel that dampen and suppress Psykers, just as the black ships are designed to do. They'll also have access to experts who can assess and interrogate potential candidates who can undergo training aboard their own ship, after which they could be put to use. Not as officially Imperium-approved Psykers from Terra, although Inquisitors have the authority to basically designate rogue Psykers as having been trained and approved under their own banner, as it were, which makes them as good as officially designated Imperium Psykers. Not to mention the fact that, of course, the situation here is extremely urgent, and if rules have to be bent along the way to get the job done, the Inquisitor is going to do that without so much as a second thought, unless of course they were a particularly straight as an arrow Puritan Inquisitor. So in their time from being consigned aboard a prison ship, it's no wonder that a rogue Psyker would be open to accepting this kind of role. They could, if they survived, shortcut the harrowing practices of terror and potentially become part of an Inquisitor's retinue. In terms of potential fates for a rogue Psyker, serving in this role is really akin to winning the lottery. The overseeing Inquisitor has deemed them safe for deployment, although safe is presumably within the boundaries of acceptable risk by the Inquisitor who's looking at this investigation of Hive Tertium. And those boundaries are likely entirely dictated to their ideological outlook, which leaves a lot open to interpretation. So to finish today, I would like to think a little about those corrupted individuals of the Mobian Sixth. And I think to start, it would be good to have a quote from William Peter Blatty. I think the demon's target is not the possessed. It is us, the observers. I think the point is to make us despair, to reject our own humanity, to see ourselves as ultimately bestial, as ultimately vile and putrescent, without dignity, ugly, unworthy. This is of course a quote from The Exorcist, the book, not the film, although it was of course included in an updated cut of the movie. I've always thought about William Peter Blatty's exploration of the demonic, and not because of its horror, but because of its subtlety. In the verse of 40k, we're often confronted with the appalling, very visceral effects of chaos, but there are of course far more invasive, subtle elements at play, and this is where we come to the idea of the corrupted elements of humanity. The diabolic foe seek to make humans question their reality, to lead them astray from the path of faith and loyalty into the waiting arms of those who take on subtle forms and employ the most malignant of strategies to achieve their goals. Those who are twisted to the will of chaos and the darkness of the void unwittingly are one of the most disturbing elements of chaos. To see how their imperceptible malfeasance distorts the stable reality of a person's mind, how it can bend their will to its own ends without them even becoming aware that it is happening. Often, this occurs through promises of achievement, or through, as Blatty explores, this idea of someone being pushed to a point they despair so much they begin to question and reject humanity. In terms of 40k, that would be the dark descent into becoming a traitor and a heretic in the eyes of the Imperium. For the Imperial Guard, who were trained on Atoma Prime, equipped, indoctrinated, told that they were the best, they were the members of the Emperor's Astra Militarum, the Imperial Guard, handed a lasgun and deployed onto feral death worlds to face unseen enemies in the fringe of their system space. It's no wonder that they would be quickly broken as they come face to face with unknowable, unforeseeable horrors. This is where the intriguing concept of precisely what chaos is comes into play. Is it the physical manifestations that send guardsmen screaming from their trenches as the foul, spewing monstrosities pour in over them, poisoning their lungs, blistering their skin, and for some, making them putrefy in real time? For any who can escape, the horrors they witness begin to twist their minds, they begin to despair. For the strongest among them, they will take heart and faith in the Emperor. Their lives will have been spent to this point being indoctrinated into the Imperial faith, as are all citizens upon the worlds of the Imperium. However, these are not Astartes. They're not Grey Knights or Inquisitors, they're merely the men and women of their hive world, far from being unbreakable, and sometimes the reality of what they face is just unbearable. Now this is actually something that I think again is commonly misunderstood, but it's described within many narratives of the 40k verse that the threats of the Xenos and Chaos faced by ordinary humans upon hive worlds are not always of the explicit variety. That is to say, it's not always a gigantic acid-spitting monstrosity that breaks the will of mortals and that sends the worlds of humanity into a downward spiral of ruination, although obviously that does happen. For some planets who have faced, for example, an oncoming Tyranid assault, or for those close to the Great Rift or intense warp storms that are bleeding into reality, ordinary humans are, well, ordinary. Their minds are very easily affected in simple ways: headaches, pain, sleep deprivation. An Imperial Guard regiment can be trained as tough as you like, but a week without sleep will see them at breaking point easily, and sometimes That's all it takes, and this has been looked at in various narratives throughout the 40k verse, where worlds begin to crumble simply by the citizenry being affected in very basic ways. So we often and understandably think of chaos in the most insidious terms possible, grandiose schemes that threaten to bring down entire worlds like a house of cards, massive planetary assaults featuring traitor legions of Astartes and ancient unspeakable weaponry from M30 that can destroy entire cities. Yet it need not be anything as impressive. Humans are fundamentally weak. We need rest, we need food and water. Deprived of those things, we don't last long. So out on the fringe of the Mobian domain, the never-ending grind of battle guard regiments that are never rotated back to their homeworld for relief, they're simply abandoned in a forgotten corner of their system, fighting a brutal war that none at home are really aware of, and on a daily basis barely spare a passing thought for. So I think it's reasonable to speculate that all of this combined would contribute to very low morale and continual physical and psychological trauma to their regiments. Again, remember this is me purely speculating now. We might imagine that the Mobian 6th Regiment have been grinding away at their enemy for decades, and those not killed or broken have to see those around them become killed and broken. They're exhausted, under-equipped, and steadily become ever more bitter and resentful that what they must endure is barely being acknowledged at home. In many ways this is not unusual, it's even comparable for that matter to the triggers of the heresy. Astartes' legions felt underappreciated, found a means by which to achieve true glory in their eyes. I think it's fair to imagine that what has happened to Atoma Prime is something that has continually played out throughout the galaxy ever since the end of the heresy. In many ways we might consider that since the heresy it has in fact never truly ended, as the same process plays out again and again. In attempting to keep reality safely distanced from a citizenry, those fighting for the great cause of their system become bitter and resentful, just as many will remain loyal, carried forward by their faith and their sense of duty and service, many truly believing in the Imperial faith, but in the darkened corners, small groups whisper rumblings of discontent, officers become supportive of the cause, and without warning, heresy is upon them. So without really knowing it, they've been twisted by the warp, they've become the very DARKTIDE they were sent to destroy. Other regiments may be unaware of this, or destroyed, or amalgamated into the traitors. New arriving ships from Tertium, totally unaware of what is occurring. All seems fine as they approach their designated holding position to await further orders. Small delegations arrive to board the ships for inspection. Soon fighting breaks out. Within weeks, the ships fall. Their crew corrupted or dead, they begin a journey back to Atoma Prime to further spread their toxic, corrupting contamination. By the time the administrative members of Tertium understand what is happening, it's far too late. As Dan Abnett himself stated recently regarding the Mobian 6th, ultimately, they're not just monsters looming out of the dark to kill you, they're highly trained, experienced, veteran troopers with full military gear. They've been seduced by the creed of the DARKTIDE and they have come home, not simply to kill and exact vengeance, but more poignantly to share the truth they have uncovered. They truly believe they've seen the light and that the dark ways they have discovered are far better and more liberating than the stagnant rubrics of the Imperium. They want to share that truth with you and every living soul on Atoma. So, as always, hope you enjoyed another dive back into DARKTIDE today. As a final reminder, you can pre-order the game right now on Steam. The release date for the game is November 30th, coming up very fast. Now, we're not far from taking on those immersive roles of the Imperial prisoners rejected by the Imperium, cast aside to an almost certain fate of death, now given a sliver of a chance for redemption. And I think everybody is very much hoping that this is going to be what we hope it can be. I already have quite a few people reaching out to me to want to play this together, and I'm looking forward to this being this last final effort to prove our character's worth, to serve the Emperor, the Inquisition that's deemed our lives necessary again. Our mission gives little chance of any survival. We're little more than currency of flesh amidst an ocean void of trillions of human souls seen by the Imperium as numbers on a data slate. The citizenry of Tertium until now were very insulated from the reality of the galaxy. Imperial propaganda told them only as ever as much as was necessary. Victories, glory, the greater collective good. And now that war that was once a distant passing thought is breaking down the front door. The citizenry have told, of course, that this only proves that they need to serve the Imperium to give themselves to its wider purpose, give their lives unconditionally. In the dark, far future of M41, human lives count for little more than those of us condemned prisoners whose lives are already judged to be over. Now billions of human lives are judged by an invisible Inquisitor on a similar scale. What is their worth? What is an individual worth? What are 100, 10,000, 1 billion, a hive city? Is Tertium and Atoma Prime worth saving, or is it beyond redemption? The fate of 90 billion souls lies in the hands of a single member of the Inquisition. They're waiting for our report. Our success could make the difference between annihilation and salvation. What awaits us? Undoubtedly the horrors and monstrosities beyond human imagination, but perhaps also a second chance at a life well lived. The glory of preventing Atoma Prime and Tertium from falling into oblivion. To make that a reality, we must enter the darkness and face humanity's worst nightmares. The Inquisition will never allow a world as large as Atoma Prime to fall to darkness. The campaigns it could subsequently launch with such a force are entirely unacceptable. If we cannot successfully investigate the Darktide, provide the information and means by which to prevent the ruination of Tertium, only one option will remain. A choice none would wish to make, the orbital scouring of a world as vast as Atoma Prime and its 90 billion souls burned to ashes.